Welcome to This Explainer. Right now, there's a massive amount of hype surrounding the upcoming cinematic blockbuster, The Odyssey. And honestly, it makes sense. For centuries, this tale has been celebrated as the ultimate adventure. But today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to peel back about 2,700 years of mythology, look past the beautiful poetry, and dig into the gritty, profound historical truth behind Troy. If you've seen the trailers for this intense Hollywood drama, you know exactly what we're in for. It's packed with vengeance, relentless action, and a desperate king fighting tooth and nail to reclaim his stolen household. You hear these intense, sweeping declarations from a man willing to literally defy fate and even the gods themselves, just to get back to his wife and son. I mean, it absolutely makes for incredible cinema. But here is the million-dollar question, right? Before we get completely swept away by the movie magic and the stunning visuals of sea monsters and warring deities, we really have to ask ourselves where Homer's epic poem ends and the literal geographical facts begin. What is the actual historical truth behind Troy and this legendary man we call Odysseus? Let's kick things off with part one, the epic journey home. To truly understand the reality of this epic journey, we first have to wrap our heads around the sheer, massive scale of this ancient narrative. Penned by the blind Greek poet Homer way back around 700 BC, this is a colossal 12,109-line epic. It was literally the cultural cornerstone of ancient Greece, and it maps out the staggering timeline of King Odysseus' struggle. We're talking about 20 entire years of his life just gone. 10 brutal years fighting the Trojan War, which famously ended with that sneaky wooden Trojan horse trick. And then 10 agonizing years lost at sea, battling nature and literal monsters just to find his way back to his kingdom of Ithaca. And the tragedy wasn't just happening out on the ocean. Back home, rumors that he had died led to absolute, total chaos. Over 100 greedy suitors invaded his palace. They were eating his food, drinking all his wine, completely disrespecting his household. Meanwhile, his brilliant wife Penelope somehow managed to hold them off for 3 agonizing years with this incredibly suspenseful trick. She told them she would finally choose a husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud. But secretly, she would unravel it, thread by thread, every single night under the cover of darkness. All while his son, Telemachus, grew into a man waiting for a father he never truly knew. Which brings us to part 2, unearthing the real Troy. So, for about 2,500 years, the smartest scholars in the world basically assumed the Trojan War was entirely fictional. They figured Troy was just a magical, made-up setting invented by Homer. No more real than Atlantis. But that assumption was totally shattered in 1870. A German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann actually dug up the real, burnt ruins of Troy at a site called Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey. Archaeologists later swooped in and confirmed that these ruins date back to right around 1200 BC, complete with heavy fire damage and ancient weapons. Honestly, this is one of my absolute favorite facts about this whole story. Schliemann wasn't even a formally trained archaeologist. He was just a businessman who loved Homer's poem and said, you know what, I think this is a literal map. By proving that a massive, fiery war actually happened around 1200 BC, Schliemann forces us to completely reconsider the historical truth behind Troy. It really begs the question, if the city was real, what other parts of this wild myth might actually be grounded in hard facts? Let's dive into part 3, the science of monsters. Okay, so if the city of Troy was real and the war was real, then we have to decode the terrifying creatures that Odysseus fought on his way back. I mean, surely 6-headed sea serpents and one-eyed giants didn't exist, right? Well, when we actually map these legendary beasts to real-world biology and geography, we find something amazing. The ancient Greeks weren't just making things up out of thin air. They were trying to explain the unexplainable phenomena they were finding in their natural environment. Let's take the Cyclops Polyphemus, for example. Just imagine for a second you are an ancient Greek farmer. You're plowing your field, and suddenly you dig up this massive, heavy skull, and right in the dead center of its forehead is one giant, gaping hole. Today, science tells us that hole is simply where a prehistoric mammoth or elephant's trunk was attached. But to them, that was undeniable, terrifying proof of a giant, one-eyed, flesh-eating monster. It completely blows your mind when you look at it from their perspective, doesn't it? And what about those terrifying sea monsters? Well, scholars now believe the sirens, the ones whose sweet songs lured sailors to their deaths, were actually acoustic phenomena. Wind and water whipping through rocky Mediterranean straits created these sweet whistling sounds. Sailors would lean in to hear them, get too close to the rocks, and crash their ships. Similarly, the six-headed Scylla and the massive whirlpool Charybdis perfectly describe the very real, very deadly ocean currents and whirlpools you can actually find today in the Strait of Messina, right between Italy and Sicily. That takes us to part 4. The tragic lost sequel. So we have the history and we have the science, but the cinematic story usually ends with Odysseus finally returning home and slaughtering those greedy suitors in this grand finale of vengeance. However, there is an ancient sequel. It wasn't written by Homer, but by later Greek poets, and it takes a truly bizarre turn. It was called the Telegony, and it was basically designed to keep the legend of Odysseus alive. But here is the heartbreaking part for historians. Only 2 lines of the original ancient Greek manuscript survive today. The whole thing was almost completely lost to the ravages of time. But thankfully, we actually do know what happens, and we owe it all to a famous scholar named Proclus. He read the full manuscript about 1,500 years ago and wrote a highly detailed prose summary in his work called Chrestomathy. Because of him, we know the tragic, almost true crime-esque details of how the great king Odysseus actually met his end. Get ready, because in this wild, ancient sequel, which a lot of people view as a sort of ancient fan fiction, Odysseus actually had another son named Telegonus with the witch Circe. So Telegonus travels to Ithaca looking for his father, and he starts raiding cattle. Odysseus goes out to fight him in the dark. Because they don't recognize each other, Telegonus accidentally kills his own father using a spear tipped with a poisonous stingray spine, which was forged by the god Hephaestus. And if that wasn't enough, to make things incredibly awkward, the story ends with everyone marrying their step-parents. Seriously, Telegonus marries Penelope, and Odysseus' first son, Telemachus, marries Circe, who then just grants them all immortality. I mean, it is absolutely wild. Finally, let's look at part 5, when myth outlives reality. So, if Troy was a real place, and all these ocean hazards were real geographic locations, why cloak them in such elaborate magical mythology? Well, Homer took the very real, very gritty experiences of thousands of Greek soldiers returning from the historical Trojan War, and he cloaked their traumas in the language of gods and monsters. For a soldier coming home after 20 years away, the world they left behind is just gone. They faced unimaginable storms, terrifying enemies, and the crushing realization that their home had basically moved on without them. The literal truth of that post-war trauma, that universal PTSD, was simply too heavy to bear. So it was transformed into an allegorical epic. As you get ready for the massive cinematic spectacle hitting theaters, just remember that these ancient monsters represent our own real-world struggles. The historical truth behind Troy isn't just about some burnt ruins in Turkey, it is deeply about the human condition. It really leaves us to wonder, what everyday obstacles are you turning into mythology? What is the Cyclops in your own epic journey? Think about that for a bit and keep exploring.